3-month and the 10-year. The 10-year yield today is well below the 3-month yield. Again, a possible indicator of a recession.
Marketplace is supported by Acquia, the open-source digital experience company. At Acquia, they power websites, applications, and online experiences for some of the largest brands around the world. More at acquia.com. And by Personal Capital, introducing a new high-yield account, Personal Capital Cash, FDIC insured. Learn more at personalcapital.com/cash.
All right, we got to go. 767 to the downside on the Dow today, 2.9%. The Nasdaq off 278 points, 3.4%. The S&P 500, 87 points in the red, 2.9% there. Our daily production team includes Bridget Bodner, Maria Hollenhorst, Sean McHenry, Daisy Palacios, and Daniel Shen. Our special projects desk is Tommy Andres and Eliza Mills. I'm Kai Risdall. We will see you tomorrow, everybody. This is APM.
This is 90.9 WBUR, WBUR.org. Just ahead, it's On Point. The weekend mass shootings focusing the country on gun policy and questions of domestic terrorism. Then at 8 o'clock, best-selling crime novelist Laura Lippman discusses her new novel and city, Baltimore. All begins next. On Point here on 90.9 WBUR, Boston's NPR news station.
We're funded by you, our listeners, and by Salem 5 Bank, introducing the Open Account, one checking choice open to everyone. Visit
Welcome to WBUR City Space at the Levine Broadcast Center. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
And book fitness classes at local studios. Fitness studios can list their business at mindbodyonline.com/Boston.
You're listening to 90.9 WBUR FM Boston,
92.7 WBUA Tisbury,
89.1 WBUH Brewster,
Streaming at WBUR.org,
and live at City Space, Boston's new home for public conversation.
WBUR, Boston's NPR news station.
Major funding for On Point is provided by Geico, offering auto insurance coverage for cars, trucks, or SUVs, and providing 24/7 customer service. More information on auto insurance at geico.com or 1-800-947-AUTO.
From NPR and WBUR Boston, I'm David Folkenflick, and this is On Point. A pair of seemingly unrelated massacres separated by 13 hours and 1,600 miles tore apart two cities, El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio. The twin calamities raised questions for many Americans about the government's approach to gun violence and white supremacism. In El Paso, the shooter's been linked to a manifesto targeting Latinos, and the president's rhetoric is under greater scrutiny. This hour On Point, the aftermath of the newest mass shootings. First, this news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Speer. President Donald Trump will visit El Paso on Wednesday as that city deals with the deaths of 22 people and the wounding of dozens more this past weekend at a Walmart there. That's after a gunman who prosecutors say had posted a racist anti-immigrant screed entered the packed store and began firing indiscriminately. El Paso Mayor Dee Margo says the community along the Texas border is trying to recover.
While borders may separate us, our grief transcends them.
You pay attention with so much at stake.
Seas are rising and chronic flooding will be the new normal.
You navigate, you listen, you keep an ear out. You pay attention, and so do we. We tell the stories of our time every day.
In the 26th day of testimony and on the 139th witness, Shahar Tsarnaev wept.
We unearth what would otherwise stay hidden.
There's just a lot of hate in this world, and that day, for that hour, we were humans.
Across the street,
the Red Sox have won the World Series.
And around the globe.
It's here and now.
This is Modern Love.
This is WBUR's All Things Considered.
This is only a game.
This is On Point.
This is Radio Boston.
On air, online, on demand, and on stage in the heart of Boston.
I'm Jack Lepiars. Welcome to WBUR City Space.
Always looking forward, paying attention, and knowing that your story is one of our stories.
Good morning. I'm Bob Oates.
I'm Lisa Mullins. I'm Meghna Chakraborty.
I'm Jeremy Hobson.
This is 90.9 WBUR Boston.
Hello and welcome. I am Catherine Lusk. I serve as the co-director of the Boston University Initiative on Cities alongside Graham Wilson. On behalf of the Initiative on Cities, BU's Urban Climate Initiative, and with the support of the National Science Foundation, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Because I can still see you, I want to ask, how many of you are at WBUR City Space for the first time this evening? Yahoo! All right. It's fitting that we're hosting this conversation here. Certainly, it's aptly named. But also, when the Initiative on Cities was founded 5 years ago, we were started by BU President Bob Brown and the late Mayor of Boston, Tom Menino. And the initiative was conceived as a place, a mechanism through which BU and our community could connect to the issues and challenges and opportunities affecting cities. And we do that in a variety of ways. We do that through research, we do it through experiential learning opportunities for students, and we also do it through critical dialogues like this one. And I am particularly pleased to be bringing you this discussion tonight with three real vanguards in urban planning. And the task that has been posed to them this evening is to present us with opportunities and give us a real sense of what's possible. So we oftentimes have sort of smart city conversations, and we look to the future, and we think of sort of these big visionary technologies that are going to save the day. But really here we're about to talk about what is achievable, what is realizable, what is feasible in the near term. And I think Amy and I from WBUR City Space have talked a lot about the fact that we are seeing this kind of crowd for this kind of conversation. And I like to think if you pick a few topics that this city gets really excited and frustrated about, it's housing, it's climate change, it's transportation, and it's equity. And I think that's what's really exciting is the task before our three speakers tonight is to bring all of those together and to offer us lessons here in Boston from Vancouver, from Toronto, from Minneapolis about realizing a more sustainable city. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Moran, who's going to be moderating our session this evening. But I want to briefly introduce our speakers. We're going to start with Jennifer Keesmaat, who served as the chief planner for the City of Toronto from 2012 to 2017, where she led transformative transportation and infrastructure projects. She also ran as candidate for mayor of Toronto in 2018. We love mayors and those who aspire to be mayors. We're also joined by Gil Kelly, who has been the General Manager of Planning, Urban Design, and Sustainability for the City of Vancouver since 2016. He was previously the Director of Citywide Planning for San Francisco, and before that, Director of Planning for Portland, Oregon, so he can also offer us insights of what is, in fact, translatable from Canada to the U.S. And lastly, Heather Worthington has been the Director of Long Range Planning for the City of Minneapolis since 2017. For those who don't know, Minneapolis has been making headlines for its recent decision to upzone all single-family neighborhoods. However, it's important to think about that as one piece of a comprehensive master plan and many new policies and programs that the city is implementing to right the injustices of housing inequity and redlining. I'm grateful to our moderator, Barbara Moran. She's the Senior Producing Editor for the Environment with WBUR, for leading the discussion. One last note, which is, oh, I need a slide. No, slide, nope. Slide. Okay. We will be taking questions. This is a 90-minute session for a reason, and so it's one of the reasons is that we can hear from all of you, and you get to pose questions to the panelists. But in order to get more questions and to ensure that we have streamlined questions and get to as many as we can, we will be using Slido. Visit slido.com and enter the event code, capital UP805, and input your question, and you'll see it on the screen. Thank you. And Barbara and Gil and Jennifer and Heather, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Oh, wait, there's so many mics.
I'll leave this one here. So I'm supposed to wait. I'm supposed to go down. Okay. All right, we're off to a great start. Is this? Oh, okay. Excellent. All right, welcome everybody. Usually when I do these things, it's pouring rain and everybody's soaked and freezing. So this is great. You brought the good weather. Thank you. I'm Barbara Moran. I'm the environmental editor here at WBUR, and welcome everyone. We're going to have a discussion up here for about 40 minutes or so, and then open it to questions. So we'll cover a lot of the bases here and hopefully trigger a lot of questions from the audience. I wanted to start with a chart to talk about Boston and our greenhouse gas emissions here. And this came out today, I believe, the 2017 numbers. And thank you. It's Friday, sorry, 3 days ago. I'm 3 days late. Thank you to Cutler Cleveland, if he's here, for sending me this high-res version hours ago. So this is the situation here in Boston, with about 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions coming from buildings and about 28% coming from transportation. So as a city trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, those are the two big old targets that we're going at. So we're going to talk to these smart folks about what they're doing in their cities to tackle both of these things. We're going to start with transit, and I wanted to bring up that first train slide, Adam. Great. Okay, thank you. So I like this picture because it looks to me like the green line. It looks just like the E line to me on Huntington Ave, or maybe this one out here. Okay, but it's not. So anybody from the audience know what city this is? Oh, you guys are so smart. No tricks. Yes, this is Toronto. This is King Street. And Jennifer, can you tell us a little bit about King Street in Toronto for those people who haven't been to Toronto, and what's going on here in this picture?
Sure. Hello, everyone. To set the context, Toronto is 617 square kilometers, so it's a really large land area. It's an amalgamated city. It was 7 municipalities. It's now 1. And it has a population of 2.9 million and is growing by approximately 100,000 people annually, so there's a lot of growth. King Street runs right along the waterfront and is one of our historic streets that also extends into our suburbs into the east and the west. So it runs right through many of our older neighborhoods, our streetcar neighborhoods, as well as our financial district, our entertainment district, and right in the heart of the city. And the challenge we faced with King Street, we had great transit ridership, but the streetcar moved very slowly and was very unreliable.
We don't know anything about that here.
Oh, is this ringing a bell? This sounds familiar. In fact, my daughter, we live in Midtown, right in the center of the city, and she was a rower. She's actually rowed here in Boston. She was going to rowing on the waterfront, and she came home after one of her long trips. It took her about an hour to get down to the waterfront, and she had to ride the King Street car, and she walked in the door, and she kind of slammed the door behind her, and she was really angry. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I've got all my bags from school, and I'm sitting on the streetcar, and I would get out and walk, but I have all my bags. People are walking faster than the streetcar is moving." And the only reason she was staying on the streetcar was because she had her gym bag, she had her school bag, but she was incredibly frustrated. And of course, we collected a tremendous amount of data before we initiated the King Street pilot, and we discovered, lo and behold, the streetcar was moving slower than walking. Now, there was also a reliability problem. And there was a capacity problem. One of the reasons it was moving so slowly was because of bunching, but also because of volume. There were so many people getting on the streetcar. And so we had this question that we asked, which was, is there an easy win? Is there a quick win? Is there something that we can do here to transform this corridor? Do you want me to tell the whole story right now?
I'd also like to point out in this picture that there's a lot of other action going on, right? There's like
very busy street.
Cars and this person almost getting hit, and she doesn't even know. And right, and the lights. I can tell just by the picture that the lights aren't lined up. Right, so you have this really innovative sort of amazing solution for this, or pilot solution for this?
Yeah, so the first thing we did was we collected data, and we learned this, of course, from Michael Bloomberg in New York, start with data. And the first thing that we learned was that cars were moving 16% of the people in the corridor, but they were taking up 64% of the space. So this was golden. This actually became a really important driver in shifting the narrative in the city, because the minute we talked about moving cars out of the corridor, people started screaming, "War on the car, war on the car." And so we had to have something in our toolkit that we could throw up and actually say, well, hold on a minute. Is it really the war on the car? Let's see what's happening in this corridor. We're moving a significant number of people. And in fact, already before the pilot, we were moving, it was one of the busiest surface routes in North America, moving 60,000 people a day. So a lot of people going right into the center of the city. So the pilot was really about asking the question if there was a way we could allocate the space in order to better respond to moving people efficiently. And so a big part of this involved a 2-year campaign about talking about what our roads were for. Are our roads for moving cars, or are our roads for moving people? And if our roads are for moving people, cars are doing a pretty terrible job.
Yeah. Adam, can you put up one of the after pictures? So this is. You can tell, friendly crowd, yes.
So coming back.
Here? We're just going to stay here.
Right. Okay, so tell me, so what did you actually do? Did you actually ban all the cars from this corridor?
Yeah, we sort of did, actually. So we had a little problem, because what we wanted to do was the goal was to get the cars out of the way so that transit could be the priority. And we literally called it a transit priority corridor. The challenge was that over many years, there had been a tremendous amount of intensification, new density added along this corridor. And in some instances, this is why planning really matters, with very little foresight, the entrances to the underground parking garages actually accessed on King Street. So a lot of people who were pro doing something about King said, just get rid of the cars altogether. And we said, well, we can't actually do that because we have some underground parking that you must access from King Street. We also, of course, had a problem with some local businesses who were very concerned that in some way this was going to have a negative impact on their business. And for that reason, we also collected data on business activity along the corridor, because we wanted to be able to demonstrate that at the very least, the pilot was net neutral. And in fact, we collected a ton of data and discovered that it was very positive for businesses. The reason being, once we got the cars out of the way by implementing a system where you can only travel on each block in a car for local access only. So you have a forced right-hand turn on both sides of the street at every block. So you can never go through the stoplight. So what this means is you can never travel along the corridor in a car. You can go to one shop on that block. And what that effectively did was it took all the cars off of the corridor, other than the very rare local access. This meant suddenly people who had a 45-minute commute from the west end of the city into the core had a 17-minute commute. Can you imagine? It was such a crazy win. And we were really concerned about volume, and that did happen. So now there's approximately 86,000 people a day use this corridor. Just to put that in context, we have a subway that we built in the northern part of our city about 10 years ago for, in today's dollars, about $1.5 billion. And that subway moves approximately 22,000 people a day. King Street now moves 86,000 people a day. And the pilot was $1.5 million, which was not enough money. It should have been more. But then what we were able to do was this, once we figured out the movement, because transit was the priority, then all of a sudden we had something really golden, because we'd taken away the street side parking, which was we had public realm. And so the next phase became introducing new cafes where the street side parking had been, new parkettes. We are doing urban forestry in the right of ways as well. We have seedlings that are planted and incubate along the corridor and then later get planted in parks. So there's been a whole kind of renewal of the corridor that's all about creating places for people as well as a place for movement.
Adam, can you show the second picture? The other after picture has people in it. Look at all those people.
And those are the trees. So urban forestry. So in various places along the corridor, we have trees that need a very high level of attention as they're growing and before they're transplanted. And so having them very close to, this is just around the corner from Metro Hall. In the back corner, right over there, is a building filled with city staff. What an awesome location to have these trees that need a high level of nurturing just outside of the door of city staff. But it also creates a really fabulous place for lingering in the corridor. We didn't want the whole thing to be commercial. We wanted there to be places that were just about public realm and about lingering.
That's great. Thanks. I wanted to start with a sort of success story to inspire us all. So let's, the other transit thing that I saw some other photos of this that show some bike docks, right? So did this open this corridor for bicycling too? And then I wanted to have you other guys talk about bicycling too.
Yeah, so this is a good segue into cycling because when we were proposing this, we were really concerned, and I'm a cyclist myself. I actually cycled around here this afternoon on one of your blue bikes, which is awesome. And I found drivers to be very respectful, I'll add. I thought that might be contentious. That's why I thought I would put it out there, do a little bridge building here. In this corridor, the number one priority was a transit corridor. Then the second was redefining the public space in the corridor. One of the challenges was, of course, how to handle cyclists. Do cyclists get their own space? Do they get their own right-of-way? And where there's streetcar tracks, it's always tricky for cyclists anyway. We were very, very fortunate to have the executive director of Cycle Toronto, which is our cycling advocacy organization. We basically cut a deal with him where we said, look, we're actually going to leave cycling, not because it's not important, it's very important, but because we need the transit win. If this fails, we felt the stakes were very high because if this failed, it would, for example, we didn't see an increase in ridership, we didn't see improvements in reliability. We would have a very hard time extending any of this in the future, and it would also mean something golden, a quick win, would have slipped through our fingers. So we were very careful about crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, and that meant that we didn't actually do anything for cycling. And an amazing thing happened. There's a parallel corridor to this one where we put in a cycle track, and so we took a systems approach. There's not going to be a cycle track on this corridor. There simply isn't enough room. But there's a cycle track one block over. So it was about looking at the broader context. And this is a transit priority corridor. The next corridor to the south is a cycle track. But the amazing thing is that cyclists love this because once we got the cars out of the way, it became a wonderful corridor for cycling. So it has been a massive win. 98% of cyclists who use the corridor, and the cycling has shot through the roof, are 100% supportive of the King Street pilot.
Great, thanks. Gail, I wanted to ask you a little bit about cycling and then go to Heather. What's the situation in Vancouver as far as?
Well, we're a cycling city, I've got to say, and a number of the West Coast cities qualify, I think, as well. Probably because of our temperate weather. Even though we're Canadian, we're pretty temperate. There are actually palm trees that grow in Vancouver. Yeah, there are. I should have brought a picture of one of those this evening. But I would say that the cycling culture has gotten a couple of shots in the arm. And one of them occurred in the early 2000s when the mayor and city council said, we're going to take a lane away from a critical bridge entering the downtown. And you have to realize, if you haven't been there in Vancouver, the downtown, the core city, is really located on a narrow peninsula. And so you almost always have to take one of 4 bridges to get in and out of downtown. So they built on an earlier planning effort from the 90s, which said, we want to create a living first policy. So they brought 30 to 40,000 new dwelling units into the downtown peninsula that weren't there before, and trips actually reduced by 20,000. It was remarkable. So kind of on that strength, they overcame, business association resistance. Traffic isn't going to be able to get in and out as quickly, and therefore we're going to lose customers. A lot of commuters were up in arms, ready to kick out that city council and turn it over to a more conservative council, and they persisted. And a year later, everyone had come around like it's the best thing, and businesses' revenues had actually gone up. People were no longer just circulating around the downtown on their bikes. They were able to make cross-city trips. And I think that spawned a whole generation of really quick, in succession capital improvements around the city. And so a big chunk of the city capital budget was diverted into doing bike routes, and some very controversial ones through neighborhoods that thought their lives were ending because there's all these bicyclists driving in front of my driveway. Well, that's now become accepted. And so there's still a sting in the political arena a little bit from that being forced down people's throat, but change doesn't always happen easily. And
Does it ever happen easily?
Well, no, I would say that we have a brand new city council, many of whom ran against the policies of the last council. Once they got into office, they haven't really changed course. They realize how much strength there is in the community around kind of doing the right thing. If anything, they ran on and now voice the idea of having deeper and broader consultation around changes, but not really stopping the direction. So I find that very interesting. So we are a biking city. We're also building a new subway along the Broadway corridor out to University of British Columbia, which has a little city of its own of about 80,000 people out on the tip of another peninsula. So there's successive investments in all kinds of non-auto traffic. We have about 53% of citywide trips, all trips, that are by walking, cycling, or transit. And we're trying, under our new climate emergency action plan we just produced, to bump that up into the 70% or so by 2030. 2050 is no longer relevant, it's now 2030, according to the International Panel on Climate Change. So we've accelerated all our action, and I think biking and walking plays very heavily into that agenda.
All right, Heather, so when we were talking before, you were talking about the importance of biking in Minneapolis, I was laughing because I was like,
you laughed at me.
Right, I did laugh at you. Then so I was Googling this.
You didn't believe me, did you?
I didn't believe it, right. So and I found this article in Bicycling Magazine saying that Minneapolis is one of 5 cities with the most badass winter bike commuters. Right. So congratulations.
Definitely
that's a good list to make.
Yes.
And then I found this photo, Adam. All right. So I was looking for a photo, right? Found this guy. This is from this article from January called Polar Vortex Can't Stop Minnesota Bike Commuters. So this is apparently a real thing. And he said the beard ice is part of the magic.
Yeah,
this
totally.
guy said. All right.
Well,
so there is bike commuting in Minneapolis.
Absolutely.
You weren't lying to me. All right. So tell me, what is the situation? I mean, imagine Minneapolis is quite a bit more spread out than other cities. And so are people, are there certain bike, I don't know.
So
tell me
Minneapolis is 428,052 square miles. So it's not a huge city, certainly not by Toronto standards, but it is a flat city, which makes it very bikeable. And so, I have a number of friends and staff members who ride their bikes year round. There were a few days last year when it was down in the 30 below ambient temperatures where people went, I think I'll take the bus today. But generally, they're pretty committed to it. And, they run studded tires and big fat tire bikes, and they have the gear. I was telling you they have, handlebar mitts and foot covers and, I don't know, heated seats.
Wow, you're badass. Anyway, it says here, said in the magazine.
Yeah. So they're pretty hardcore. Yeah, absolutely.
So as part, I understand Minneapolis just passed this new plan, the 2040
plan,
right? So is bicycling involved in that? And then transition over?
Absolutely. I mean, we see it as a mode share issue for Minneapolis. I mean, much like I'm sure Toronto and Vancouver do. But, I think part of our challenge has been what Jennifer touched on a moment ago, which is sort of this assumption that if there are more bikes, that means that there's some kind of war on cars. And I was challenged many times during the 2040 process. And I said, Minneapolis was built as a car-centric city. So if you think about how cities develop over time, the railroads really were the primary sort of instrument for laying out our cities early in the 19th century or the mid 19th century, and then in the 1920s and 30s it really became a car-oriented community. So we had streetcars, but we successfully got rid of those in the 1950s and went to a city bus system. And so you see a city that tends to be very car-centric, and let me just speak to that on a couple of different levels. One is that we tend to provide a relatively inexpensive parking and structured parking in great quantities. And we tax that at a different rate than we tax other uses. So there's a problem, right, from an economic standpoint. And secondly, we actually incentivize the construction of parking, or have up until now. And so that really urges a lot of people to choose their car over biking. And I'll use myself as an example. I have a 7-mile commute, and it takes me about 13 minutes to get to work, and I have free parking in my building. So that's really nice. Now, I could easily ride my bike to work, but I choose not to because I am incentivized not to. And so I am just one person of thousands who live that life because of the way we have structured our parking, in particular in a large downtown. So now with the 2040 plan, we have said that we're eliminating parking minimums. That might be a bigger headline than single-family zoning. And then we have also said downtown in the core, there are no height limits for buildings, and we are not requiring parking minimums in the core any longer. What we realize today is that we have completely overbuilt our structured parking systems, and that has an important impact on our future land use and on the ability to use that land in a different way to achieve other goals like housing and workforce goals. So again, we have to kind of see, I think biking and mode share and transit issues are all related with workforce labor issues and with housing issues. And so we have to kind of see this as a system, as sort of an ecosystem of planning.
Okay.
Are you going to jump off the biking? Can I just weigh in with one little piece on this? So 2 little things. One is I just wanted to reinforce what Heather was saying about how there's all kinds of often perverse incentives that are going against our sustainability objectives or our broader city building objectives. And you have to dig deep to find those perverse incentives and undo them. When I became the chief planner in the city of Toronto, I too was told that I had a free parking spot, and so I said, I don't want it, but what I would like is free transit. And free transit is worth a fraction of what the free parking spot is worth. And the administration lost their minds. They completely lost their minds. And I said to him, look, I need you to figure this out because I don't want to work in an organization if I can't offer my staff a transit incentive instead of a parking incentive. And I'm not kidding. They lost their minds. They went crazy. The parking's easy. Free transit. Ooh. And they even ended up setting up this weird system where I had to pay for it and they paid me back.
Yes.
And it was really dumb because it was so minuscule in comparison to the magnitude of the benefit of the parking spot. But it was a principle to me. It was just so absurd that the city was incentivizing something that went against a series of fundamental policy objectives that existed more broadly.
And I should add that we are building new public service center, and we will have no parking, and we will have bike lockers and showers in the new building. Yay. So that's a huge improvement, and my car will sit in the garage.
Gail, what about you? Giving up your parking spot?
Well, actually,
I didn't mean to set something up here, okay?
The hot seat
No
suddenly.
pressure.
I'm happy to answer that question. I gave it up the first day of work. I have a depending on which route, I have a 17 to 19 minute commute to work by foot. Yeah. And I walk back and forth every day. I have never actually driven once to work since I've been there in 3 years. So, but I happen to live close enough that I can do that. Most of my staff bike. Those who live more remotely in the metro region will take transit. It was the same case in Portland, where almost year-round my staff, most of them would commute by bike. So in some ways, it's nice that city staff kind of walk the walk and can lead the way. But more and more, we can put in the kinds of incentives you're talking about, both in Portland and in Vancouver now.
Great. I feel like I'm kind of talking to like people from another planet.
Maybe you are.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the 2040 plan. And it's been talked about mostly for this idea of upzoning or changing away from single-family zoning. So I saw a stat that 50 to 60% of Minneapolis is currently zoned as single-family, right? And then you have this new plan that passed 12-1, which is great. But I love this is euphemism. But, quote, the passage generated lawn sign campaigns and spirited community meetings. So I'd like to hear a little bit about sort of why this rezoning idea was so important to you. Like, why does this matter, upzoning, and what was the resistance?
So you've all heard about racially restrictive covenants. Raise your hand if you haven't heard about them. Okay. So let me give you the 2-second primer on that. A racially restrictive covenant was a legal tool used to restrict the sale of property to people of a certain race. It was used beginning in about the 1900s in America. Most large cities, all large cities really had it. And that was followed by a practice called redlining. Redlining was a tool used by the federal government to determine where they would give federally underwritten home loans. And so those two tools in conjunction led to the use of single-family zoning as a tool that reinforced redlining and racially restrictive covenants. I'm giving you like literally the really high level here, because we could just talk for like an hour and a half about this. But the reality is that the federal government said you should use the zoning tools that you have as a local city to reinforce these racially restrictive practices. And so that resulted in a map today, as you say, that shows that there are large parts of Minneapolis that have a high degree of amenities. We are a city of lakes, that's our motto, and a city of beautiful parks, pretty consistently #1 park system in the U.S. And that very intentional capital outlay for single-family neighborhoods and parks and schools and other amenities that served them only served white people in our community. Up until 1958, when the state of Minnesota outlawed the use of racially restrictive covenants, and in 68 when the feds did. So we have a history that is steeped in racially biased zoning policy. And one of the things that our residents told us really early on as we started talking about this history of redlining and racially restrictive covenants was, why do we have such exclusionary zoning? Our residents asked us this. And so we started digging into this with our colleagues at Mapping Prejudice at the University of Minnesota. And we recommended to the city council that we upzone those areas of the city that were highly amenitized. So the two words that I use most often to describe this are amenities and agency. And they are linked because agency is really about your access to an elected leader or to a decision maker. And people who live in highly amenitized areas that are primarily white and middle class have much higher levels of agency when it comes to the governance process and to policy making. And so there is a direct correlation there. And we said, we really need to tackle that at that level to say, if you are a person of color and you want to live in those highly amenitized areas, we do not want to create zoning that will block you from doing that. And single-family zoning was creating a block on that. So we said to the council, how about up to 3 units? We initially said 4. We did a little fit test, discovered you can do it, but it's kind of quirky and weird, and people probably wouldn't live in that product. So we backed it down to 3. And we're getting a lot of interest in this 3-unit idea. I know here in Boston you have the triple decker, right? I mean, like, shout out to the triple deckers. Like, I have so many people who say to me, yeah, you could be like Boston or Chicago, and you could have triple deckers. And I said, absolutely, bring on the triple deckers. But I think that's part of our expansive thought process about how we utilize our land resources. differently as a city. And that's fully within our regulatory power to do that. Just like Jennifer talked about using King Street differently to serve people differently. It's the same kind of conversation. So land resources are important, but how we use them and how we think about regulating them is equally important. So the parking issue I mentioned earlier, no parking minimums. I think it's funny how Americans in particular seem to think that the street in front of their home is just an extension of their front yard, right? So people will say to me, where am I going to park my car? And I said, how about in your garage? So this is part of the ongoing conversation about, and I don't mean to be too snarky, but I think this is part of the ongoing conversation about whose resources are these and how are we sharing them and utilizing them to build a city that serves people more effectively and more efficiently. That's really, it seems pretty simple to me.
It seems like, looking at this big issue of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's all of these, it's the densification and the transit, and also, with it has to come these equity questions, which is really interesting. How about you guys with the densification? What's you don't have the problem? You're already dense enough?
Well, no, we're adding a lot of density. We have kind of a weird problem in Toronto right now because we're adding a tremendous amount of density and a tremendous amount of people on an annual basis. There are cranes all over the city. There are over 104 skyscrapers being built as we speak. There are over 70 mid-rise buildings under construction, and we define mid-rise as up to 12 stories, which a lot of cities actually consider that a tall building. So we have a lot of new building happening in the city, but strangely, we have areas of the city that are becoming much denser, inevitably, and we've linked that to where our transit infrastructure is. So our whole plan is based on intensifying around our key transit corridors because the objective is to add more people, but not to add more cars. So we have to link new housing to ensuring that people can walk, cycle, and take transit. And we've been very successful in doing that. In our downtown core, which it has a population of almost 400,000 people now, which is, a lot of people living, and has a density similar to London or Paris, although it's more in a tower form, 75% of people who live in the core walk or cycle to work. So we have a very, very, very high modal split for walking and cycling in the core of our city. But here's the challenge. We then have traditional suburban neighborhoods where we have that are losing density. For a simple reason, family sizes are becoming smaller, and it's where the concentration of wealth in the city is going. So people are tearing down 3-bedroom bungalows, and they're building 7-bedroom, 5-bathroom mansions on that same lot. So adding a significant amount of new housing on the face of it. If you just looked at the square footage, you would say, wow, lots more housing being added in these neighborhoods. But in reality, the density is going down significantly because it's fewer people living in more and more space. So we have a classic problem that exists in cities all over the world, that as we are becoming more prosperous, we're also seeing a greater divide in the socioeconomic status of the city. So we're seeing the wealthier areas of the city are becoming more and more wealthy, and that's intensifying. And then we have other layers of the city where poverty is accelerating as well. So our solution to this is adjacent to those low-density residential neighborhoods, we are building out mid-rise. So that's all those mid-rise buildings. So the objective is to ensure that everyone lives within walking distance of a main street. And the way that we do that is by adding density, because when we have the density, we can then get the main street retail that is a part of everyday life. So the goal is for people to be able to do a variety of things within walking distance of home. So you might not be able to work within walking distance of home, but you can get your hair cut and go to the dry cleaner and buy your groceries and visit a friend in a cafe and maybe go to a WeWork space. Maybe you can do all of that within walking distance of home. So the goal is adding density in every part of the city in order to achieve that. And so when I was chief planner, we upzoned a whole variety of our corridors to allow as of right anywhere, it depended on different corridors, but anywhere between 8 and 12 stories as of right. So in areas where there's just 2 stories today, you can now build 8 or 12 stories, and that's why there's a boom in that mid-rise typology. But it's a big geography, so there's lots of gaps still.
And Gil, you have a similar goal for Vancouver, right?
Yeah,
the walking goal.
I would say in terms of Canadian bragging rights, actually, although we're a smaller city than Toronto, we're a more dense city than Toronto because Toronto is huge and sprawling. The core is one thing, but the majority of the landscape.
This is a Canadian fight.
So this is how we fight in Canada.
I beg to differ.
So no, we actually are the 4th densest by population city in North America after New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. A lot of people don't know that. On the other hand, we have some very dense areas, and we are not afraid of tall towers, particularly near transit. Particularly near. She did that to me. But about 65% of our land area, the zoned areas, are really single-family neighborhoods still and very auto-dependent. So we have a big challenge upcoming in our new citywide plan to do gentle density and infill. So just in the last 3 years that I've been there, we've planned a number of neighborhoods that are the 12 to 18-story format that are well served by transit, even though they're traditional neighborhoods in some way, but there's still a vast majority of the landscape that is pretty monolithic and well protected by those voices. So we have a big job on our hands there. One thing I would say is that Vancouver's been stepping up a bit over the last couple of decades. So actually, although people refer to our broadcast zoning pattern as single family, it actually allows 3 units on any given lot, because you can have an accessory unit within your principal structure. Often those are basement suites. Sometimes they're part of a back half of a building. And you can have a rear yard cottage, or what we call laneway cottages, because they're a series of alleys referred to as lanes in BC. And so now we're sort of poking at, well, how do we get 4 to 6 units on those same kinds of lots, and how do we turn the dial so that they are primarily rental, and that at least one of those is serving a low to moderate income household. And we're looking at different ways of kind of finding third-party entities to do the sort of income qualification. It doesn't fall on the individual homeowner to do all that work and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the work that we've announced is ahead of us. And it's going to be controversial, but I think we need to get there. And there is there's both a housing and housing affordability aspect to this, a big driver in our case, but so is climate change. And, I recall about 10 years ago, I had an opportunity to have a nice fellowship across the river, and I spent a little bit of time at Lincoln Institute. There's a representative here, actually, from Lincoln tonight. To look at the nexus between urban form and GHG reduction. And all the experts at Harvard and MIT, and even from the UK visiting, said, it's about, maybe you can get a 3% reduction in GHGs if you're really, really aggressive. And I didn't believe them. So Lincoln allowed me to do a case study where I drew on my Portland experience that actually said there's nothing else that it could explain the steady decrease in per capita GHGs, even in a growing region, except the final snapping of the development investment to the long-held Oregon land use planning system that said compact urban development is the future. I looked at a lot of other variables, and sure, there were some. They were all the experts were talking about get rid of coal and all these important things, but we're really ascribing a very minuscule target to better urban form. And I think the numbers are starting to swing my way, which I think urban form, as well as better building technologies, have a huge amount to do. And that's something cities can control.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in and say, too, to your point, Jennifer, in Minneapolis in 1950, there were 5 persons per unit in the city. Today there are just slightly over 2.1, I think. I don't know who those 0.1 people are. And then, tiny little people. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that right now in Minneapolis, you can build up to 3,000 square feet on a 40-foot lot. And so if you think about that as a triplex or a triple-decker in Boston speak, that would be 1,000 unit, 3,000 unit apartments or condos or however you structured it. So, thinking about it beyond sort of the parking impact, which I think can be managed, right? On a 40-foot lot, you can build a 3-car garage if you have to have a garage. I think that these are manageable things. And I just want to also emphasize that we got a lot of pushback about new construction. And I said, part of the huge impact of new construction is that impact on GHG. And I think we have completely overlooked that from a building code standpoint in America. And, we're not building code experts here, but we work with our building officials. And one of the things that I think we need to start talking about more is that new buildings are more efficient. And in Minneapolis, we have zero runoff for new buildings. So they're more helpful in terms of environmental impact as well. So I think those are important things just to keep top of mind as we talk about new construction and density.
If I could add just one thing to the sort of neighborhood conversation, which is a tough one. If you're just talking about densities and numbers, you're going to lose the battle. So the values conversation, which has to start with listening to people's fears and their hopes, often goes to more positive questions around, I don't know if I can afford to downsize and stay in my neighborhood if you're older. I know my kids can't afford to live here, and I really want them to live here. I want there to be housing options, and I know if it's just all large single-family homes, they're not going to have that option. I also want to be able to walk to services. Like in 10 minutes, I want to get to a cafe, whatever it happens to be, some commercial spot. So the notion then of reframing it as complete neighborhood as opposed to more density coming your way is, I think, the way through the conversation in these lower density neighborhoods.
If I could just add on that, another way, so I think one of the ways is talking about a walkable neighborhood. You need a certain amount of density to be able to achieve that. Most people, something like 86% in Toronto, have indicated that they would choose a smaller home in a walkable neighborhood versus a larger home in a not walkable neighborhood for the same price. This was some research that was done by the Sustainability Institute at U of T, which is really important data, although we just have to look at the real estate market in Toronto because housing in walkable neighborhoods is really, really, really hot. So there's that. The walkable neighborhood piece is a really important personal quality of life, everyday life driver behind density. But you can flip it the other way as well. In Toronto, in our region, we have a green belt. It's 2 million hectares of protected land. And the objective of the green belt, unlike Vancouver that has the ocean and the valleys to limit growth, although Vancouver is really, really sprawling as a region.
Let's take it outside.
But not anything like Toronto.
We put in a green belt. And one of the things that we did in the context of our official plan consultations when we were negotiating with the public and building constituencies that would in fact support more density in their neighborhoods, we started every presentation talking about the region and talking about the green belt because people believe in the green belt. They want to see, they understand the importance of having local food, the importance of containing the sprawl within the region. And so we built the narrative up from the highest policy moves right down to being able to walk out and buy your groceries, to the most personal and to the most local implications. And I think the conversation has to happen in both those areas because that was a real epiphany in many of those neighborhood conversations. Often in the presentation, when people would start objecting, we would flip back up the Greenbelt slide and say, well, hold on a minute. We know we're adding 100,000 people. We know we're going to continue to add more people into this city. We also know that we want to protect our Greenbelt. Put your hand up if you want to protect the Greenbelt. And all the hands in the room would go up. And then we'll say, okay, so now the question becomes, how do we add density in a way that creates complete communities, and enhances quality of life for everyone. And we made it really an environmental imperative. And when I started out as a planner, we never did that because Al Gore hadn't done an Inconvenient Truth yet. And whenever we talked about sustainability, people went, so, but today, and really starting about 10 years ago, starting with the environment, that densification is an environmental imperative, and what is about reducing GHG emissions, that narrative really started to take root to the point now where we're adding a ton of density, and we just don't have those conversations anymore at the community level. People have really bought into it.
Great. I want to ask the group one more question before we open it to the audience. And just to spin off this idea of values. And we were talking before about, because you're American and you're Canadian, and you're like an expat. And so talking about the sort of what you see as urban planners in the United States versus Canada, as far as what people expect from government or want from government and the different views of government.
I think they just mostly want us to stay out of their lives. But I think that, but at the same time, I think there's this deep yearning for a civic conversation. So there is this sort of dissonance. I've called it progressive dissonance, is the word that I've used to describe it. So you mentioned the lawn signs earlier. We had the all are welcome lawn sign, not right next to the don't bulldoze my home lawn sign. So that's progressive dissonance, right? We have a group of people who have bought into this sort of progressive narrative, this narrative of exceptionalism in Minneapolis. You know, it's the Hubert Humphrey, the Walter Mondale group, a community that has long valued compassion and care of people. And yet we cannot seem to link that value back to our land use policy and some of the policies that we're utilizing at the local level to make people's lives better. But I think the last few days have taught us as Americans that there is a really strong need and desire for that civic conversation about these difficult policy issues. And so one of the things that I'm just intrigued with was something Gil was talking about earlier, and in Vancouver in the 1920s when you adopted your first comprehensive plan. And we do comprehensive planning every 10 years in Minneapolis. So we're just constantly in planning mode. But Vancouver has never, I think since the 1920s, you've never done a comprehensive plan. And you were saying that a lot of people don't really understand why we do planning. Mm-hmm. And I think there's an essential sort of element of, I don't necessarily think the word education is right, but there's an essential awareness element that's missing. And so I'm just going to throw it over to you.
Yeah, well, I do think, as I was mentioning earlier, that there are differences between Canada and the U.S. culturally. And one of those foundational differences, I think, and I was interested in the slide up here that you first showed about Boston's GHG emissions, and I was wondering what fugitive emissions meant, and then I realized they were Democratic voters moving from the U.S. to Canada, like me. But the principal difference I've observed, besides little language differences and so forth and so on, and the amount of red and black checkered clothing and plaid, is really, there's a very foundational belief in the role of government that's unquestioned in Canada. And here it's always at question. And I think goes right to the divisiveness or that tension that you were talking about a minute ago. And that's huge. As an urban planner working now in Canada, being able to just accept that as a starting point rather than having to always argue that point is enormous. And so I think in the case of Vancouver, and I'm sure it's true in Toronto as well, is there's an openness to innovation. It doesn't mean everything is easy and it's not without debate. But I think civic innovation is also a part of the drinking water. And so I thought I was in heaven when I was planning in Portland because there's a lot of that there too. But boy, moving to Canada, there's just an understanding that healthcare and education are basically taken for granted. They're just provided by relatively high tax rates, and that's why you believe in government. You pay money, and you look at these great foundational pieces of society that you get back. That said, it's interesting that Vancouver has proceeded all these decades since 1928 without a citywide plan. We've done a lot of great neighborhood plans, particularly in the downtown and some other close-in areas. But, and Jennifer and I were talking about this earlier, that if you ask the typical Vancouverite, so what's the plan for Vancouver? They could not tell you. They can tell you the tension they're experiencing in their neighborhood around the pace of change, new development, traffic. Sure, I want to be green, but what else is about to happen to me? There's a lot of anxiety in Vancouver because the pace of change is so rapid. And some of that is fueled by foreign investment and immigration in our case. Some of it is a whole new round of employment that is the other fugitive emission, which is U.S. tech companies locating pods in Vancouver because the immigration policies are so much more favorable, and all the Asian talent coming to work in those companies. I'm a little afraid of the Trump era politics in the U.S. And let's see, do I go to San Francisco or do I go to Vancouver? I'll go to Vancouver because I know it's friendlier there. And now Google's making a big play in Toronto, so you're seeing it across Canada. And Canada's, I don't think, used to that explosive economic growth that I experienced when I was in San Francisco. So in our case, the housing affordability crisis is not driven by wage differentials and the lack of housing production that was the case in San Francisco, where huge displacement in the Mission District and really across the city because tech workers wanted to be in this. They didn't want to be down the peninsula anymore. They wanted to be in the city, and they could pay twice the rent that any normal San Franciscan could pay. Vancouver, we don't have that yet. It's coming. What we do have is foreign investors, mostly Asian, that are parking their money in Vancouver and often leaving their units empty. So we've placed an empty homes tax. The province has put on a provincial luxury homes tax, a foreign investors tax. So we're doing a lot of work on the demand side for housing as well as on the supply side, where we're quite focused on producing rental housing. Another reason density is needed is just to make the numbers work for rental, you need to allow density. So the projects that Jennifer was referring to, where you've got 4 to 6 stories on corridors and then now 14 stories or so being kind of the new norm, I think you're seeing a lot of that in Vancouver simply to make the economics work. That being said, I think there are limits to how far you can just chase density for that incremental piece of affordability before the community just really pushes back. So that's what the upcoming conversation is about in the city plan.
Jennifer, anything you want to add about values before you open it?
Well, I'll just add 2 things. Most of what Gil said, I think, is similar in the Toronto context, except that in Toronto, if you asked a taxi driver who'd been in the city for 6 months what the city plan is, he'll probably tell you.
There you go. Right.
Because there's a really, really...
Good job.
No, I was going to say it's because there's been such a robust debate over the course of the past 15 years, and because for a whole variety of reasons, we just have so much media.
Yeah.
We have so many... the national newspaper is centered in the city and is quite biased and writes a lot about the city. We just have a ton of media. We have all the major news stations. So the media actually fuels, and it's a problem for outlying jurisdictions like Mississauga and Pickering and Brampton, because Toronto kind of sucks up all the narrative about cities. But on the flip side, it was very handy as a chief planner whenever you wanted to get a message out there, because there was so many channels. And I'm doing a bit of work with TransLink in Vancouver, and it's just really hard to get messages out because there isn't a media that's covering the issues in the way that they're covering them in Toronto. So the media has a really important role to play in building the narrative around those shared values. But there's another piece which is really just at the grassroots level. When I became the chief planner, we had just had we still had a rather infamous mayor, Rob Ford, who you may remember some of the stories about him. He was a really divisive. Not only was he, an unfortunate character, he was really divisive for the city as well. And so I created this presentation about our shared values. What are our shared values? And over the course of a year, I presented it to 130 neighborhood associations, which, think of the number of days in the year. I frequently did 3 a day. and I did them on weekends. And it was about trying to build a grassroots dialogue about what is it that our the narrative of the city hangs on. What is it that we share? What do we all value? And in some ways, I think the soil was tilled for me being able to do that for two reasons. One, we actually have a weak mayor system in Canada. All of Canada has a weak mayor system, which means as a bureaucrat, you can get out there and do that kind of thing without getting your head lopped off. And I had the advantage of having a mayor who was very distracted. He was like peeing in parks or whatever it was that he was doing in parks, unfortunately, which meant that, there was a lot I could get done kind of off the radar because he wasn't really paying attention. But that more bureaucratic system where you also have a strong administration and a strong city manager is really advantageous. And then the second is, I think, the fact that most Canadians wouldn't say this, but having worked in cities around the world now, I actually think this is really true. There is a very high level of trust in government. And it really is for two reasons. It's healthcare, which every single Canadian benefits from all the time, whether it's yourself personally or your aging parents or your niece. I had a niece who had brain surgery a year ago, and my sister-in-law was part of a support group from moms all over the world, and most of them had GoFundMe campaigns. And my whole family, we were giving to these campaigns, most of them in America, because we were so devastated that our niece had brain surgery and she fully recovered. And we didn't even think for a second about her getting the best care in the world and everything that she needed and not having to pay for it. We didn't even think twice about it. And it was devastating for us to start meeting other families that were going through the same thing, but they were worried about raising money and they were putting off the surgery until they raised the money. So that's something that it's so deeply personal. It's such a powerful part of our identity as Canadians. And then the other is access to really high quality education and post-secondary education. Our best universities are public universities, and you can get an excellent education at any of them. And so that's something as well that every Canadian touches. At the University of Toronto, which is one of the top-ranked universities in the world, it frequently for a whole variety of disciplines is in the top 10 in the world, 49% of the students at the University of Toronto are first-generation university attendees, meaning they've come from an immigrant family into Toronto, and now they're accessing a world-class education within just one generation. Arriving with a suitcase, with your shirt on your back, and accessing an excellent education. And that's a really big part of the dream of people being able to come from anywhere in the world and enter the middle class. And the education is such a fundamental part of that. So those two things have tilled the soil, I think, for municipal government to actually stand in front of a room of people and have some legitimacy. And it's not of our own doing. It's a broader cultural thing, which actually means that some of those innovations are maybe tolerated.
Right, thank you. All right, let's see if we have any questions. Were you slidoing away out there? Somebody... Slido forward. Oh, there we go. Do-do-do. Anonymous. Really? All right. Anonymous. All right, number one, how did Minneapolis deal with NIMBYism? I heard when I was reading this thing, YIMBYism.
YIMBYism.
Yes, we could talk about that. And other single-family homeowner backlash of the upzoning policy. How quickly do you expect to see redevelopment? You got 8 thumbs up. Way to go, Anonymous.
How soon do we expect to see redevelopment? So let me take the first part first. NIMBYs, not in my backyard. Banana, you've heard all these acronyms, right? Banana, build absolutely nothing, absolutely nowhere, anytime. You've heard that, right?
But I also saw YIMBYs.
YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard. It's not, it works. So the NIMBYs are small but extremely vocal and extremely well funded. And I think this is part of the challenge generally in cities today is that the NIMBY crowd tends to be well-heeled homeowners, white, upper middle class, who aren't afraid to bankroll campaigns that include lawn signs and lawsuits. And that can be an extremely difficult divide to cross for a planner at the local level, and it can be difficult to counteract if you're the YIMBY group. But in Minneapolis, what happened, and I watched this from the sidelines, I want to make sure that you understand that I did not coordinate with the YIMBYs or the NIMBYs. But one of the things we watched in Minneapolis was that the YIMBY group took every piece of information that we put out publicly. And by the way, in case you haven't looked at the website, it's about a 1,000-page website, 18,000 comments, 200 and some community meetings. I could go on and on. We put all that information out there, and every time we put out information, the YIMBY group was waiting for it, ready to pounce on it, use it to tweet, they organized a ton of, what did they call them? I'm trying to remember. Parties where they got together and there was probably adult beverages and they sat down and read the plan and made comments on it. So they did this very intentional level of engagement that I have never seen in my 23 years in local government, which was pretty impressive. I think that's the primary way that you can see a counteraction to the NIMBY problem, if you will, or the NIMBY dynamic. I think the other thing is that we just continually talked about, as Gil and Jennifer both said, we talked about values. What do you want to see this community be in the next 20 years? And I think one of the major things we heard from people was, I couldn't afford to buy my house today. I would like to stay in my neighborhood, but there's no place for me to go because it's all single family. And my kids could never afford to build or buy a house here today. So that combination of those three things was really powerful, because how many of you own a home or a condominium? Just raise your hand. Okay. And how many of you have owned that home long enough that you haven't shopped for a new place recently? So, yeah, and me too, 22 years. And one of the things I think was really surprising is when we started to talk about value and cost, people's minds were blown. They had no clue what a new home cost in Minneapolis today, because they had such long tenure in their homes. And so another part of this conversation is economics, really. When you start talking to people about a home mortgage payment being over $3,000, or worse yet, a 2-bedroom apartment renting for $2,000, people can't process that. And so it does start a different conversation, right?
2-bedroom apartment for $2,000, where?
Yeah, I know you all are like, sign me up. I'll take 2, right?
Is there parking?
But in Minneapolis, that's very expensive. Okay, so anyway, the second... Okay, mock me if you will. The second part of the conversation is really about how soon, and the council is talking about addressing the single-family issue in October. And so that means that we will do text amendment in the zoning code, and we will allow up to 3 units beginning in 2020. So, I would say, judging by the number of calls that we're getting, we're going to start to see construction pretty immediately. But I think it's important to mention what Gil said earlier about gentle density and what I like to call incremental density. You're not going to see people tearing down single-family homes that cost $250,000 and building a triplex. That's not going to happen overnight in Minneapolis. Now, that might happen in Toronto and Vancouver, but that's not going to happen in Minneapolis. So it's going to be pretty gentle, pretty incremental, yeah. And I think what we're going to see more in Minneapolis is more of that substantial development, so that 8 to 12 unit, or 8 to 12 story, up to 30 or 40 story, that's what we're seeing a lot of right now.
Okay.
I could take the next question and answer it quickly.
Which one? They
upzoning.
swapped.
Oh,
they swapped on me.
Oh, I was getting ready to do the upzoning one.
Let's do the upzoning, because that's a big issue here in Boston, and then we'll go to disabilities.
So the answer to that question, in my opinion, is yes, but. And what I mean by that is yes. In fact, it's just an overwhelming trend right now that's not going to stop anytime soon. This is a reversal of 70 years of history of moving from the core city out to the suburbs. Cities are now very desirable, and people in their 50s, 60s, 70s are coming back in from the suburbs and want to live in an urban environment. If you don't supply housing, what that does is cannibalize the existing housing stock and make that stock less affordable. What you need to do, our thesis in Vancouver is to deliver what we call the right supply, so that it is a healthy dose of rental within as well as ownership, to kind of correct an imbalance that we've seen in the production cycle over the last decade, which has mostly been on high high-end condos. Doing that through a lot of incentive programs, but also tiering our bonuses toward tiers of incomes so that we're trying to get as much workforce housing and kind of low end of market housing, as well as the sort of middle class salaries up to 150,000 or so. So the 30 to 50,000, the 50 to 80, the 80 to 150 are kind of taken care of in proportional numbers. That's how we're trying to devise our housing strategies. And we're using, private development to get most of that. At the lowest levels, we are highly dependent on senior government subsidies from the province and from the feds. And we have a very fortunate alignment right this moment. It could change in the October elections in Canada, but our city council, the provincial government, and the federal government are very much aligned in terms of supplying money for housing and for transit. So we want to take maximum advantage. That could change any time. So that may be unlike things.
I want to hear from the American now. You're just making me feel bad. So what is your solution for this? Or the upzoning is just going to price everybody out?
So I have a couple thoughts. We've gotten asked that a lot, and of course, even Richard Florida weighed in on this, and incorrectly. Sorry, Richard. But I will say that I think that without very intentional regulation of the economics behind these projects and units, we're not going to see the outcomes that we desire. So I think the key is that as we talk about our inclusionary zoning strategy, our mayor is very concerned, and rightly so, that we not slow down what has been otherwise an incredibly hot market in Minneapolis over the last 8 years. We've hit $1 billion in permit value by July of almost every year. So the market is smoking hot by any measure. So we don't want to slow that down, but at the same time, that hot market has not produced a great deal of housing equity. And in fact, we have a much higher homelessness problem in a climate, by the way, that you would not want to sleep rough in. And so so we have to really think more about the regulation side of this through inclusionary zoning and subsidy. And my pushback on some of the conversations council's been having is that I think you need to start IZ at 2 units and above. And that, I know that's crazy making. But bear with me. I think that there's a way to use subsidies where you can actually make that happen, and that's an important equity play. And then I would just also suggest that part of the conversation in Minneapolis is really about repairing some of the very deep racial disparities in the community, and reparative strategies need to be economic. And they don't necessarily need to be in the form of payments to people, but they do need to be reparative in terms of people's access to housing and workforce and transit and childcare and good education. So we have to think very differently. Again, we're kind of seeing this more asymmetrically. We tend to be, as a country, I think, politically very binary, and I think that's a challenge for America going forward generally. But I go back to what I said to you in the green room earlier, which is climate change is a very important issue. But I feel like as we sit here today, the racial disparities and the challenge of talking about race in America is our biggest challenge right now. And some of the behavior that you're seeing is really linked to that. And I think that's a huge issue for us going forward. And yes, there are ways to use planning to address those issues.
Well, I'll just say one last thing, and I can't comment at all on your last comment about the, but from an outsider, I see that, and it's hard to understand. But on the comment that you made, Heather, about the hot market, I have come to the conclusion, I'm pretty sure this is a conclusion at this point, you cannot have a hot market and have access to housing for everyone. The two are fundamentally in conflict. And the best way, and actually Vancouver has done something, I think Vancouver is doing some really exciting work in this area. And the biggest for me is zoning specifically for rental. And we have underbuilt, purpose-built rental and high quality purpose-built rental. And as a result, we have a very hot housing market. We've also then had, in North America in general, very liberal lending rules. And so people have been pushed into precarious situations to access housing because we haven't built great high-quality rental housing. And if we built high quality rental housing that is purpose built, that can meet the needs of your family over your lifetime, you wouldn't be pushed into a precarious situation. And so the only way to really temper that hot market is by being, I think, really aggressive in prioritizing building high quality purpose-built rental that is affordable. We shifted our focus about 5 years ago to rental and mistakenly thought, well, rental is affordable, right? But in our hot economy, what's happened is that the only rental that's been built is luxury rental. And the luxury rental no one would have imagined there was a market for this. And so whereas the numbers look very good in terms of our shift to building purpose-built rental, the problem is it's still not affordable. So the only way we're going to fix that is through a policy intervention and through upzoning land specifically for affordable rental. If you're building affordable rental, there's value on that site as a result of that. And Vancouver has really pioneered in that area. That is something that is a bit mind-blowing in Toronto. People can't get their heads around it yet. They think that's too much government intervention.
Just a little footnote on that. We had to push the province into changing their rules to allow us to do rental-only zoning. And part of that is just because there's now an acknowledgement throughout the province that the Vancouver and the Vancouver Metro is the least affordable metro market in North America. When you look at the wage versus typical housing price gap. So even if you tease Manhattan and Brooklyn out of New York and compare them to Vancouver, Vancouver is still higher and higher than San Francisco by that scale. So it's a full-on crisis, and there's no end in sight for the foreign investment in high end of the market that is driving land values up. So the only way to push those land values down and make rental viable or feasible is to do that rental-only zoning. Unless you've held your land for a long time and have a very low basis in it, you wouldn't do rental. So we're incenting more density and lowering parking standards and doing everything we can in a new moderate income rental program. If you provide 20% of all the units or more as long-term, meaning permanently affordable to essentially workforce housing rents. And so that's our new big play on the rental side, and hopefully it will work. We have a bunch of takers now in the system who want to do that. We'll see if council will approve them, because it is more heightened density. It's less parking on site. So the first one of those is coming to council this fall. And there are 20 lined up right behind it, so we'll see how that goes.
Okay. You wanted to add one more thing?
I just wanted to say quickly, too, that I think we have over the last 30 years, probably emphasized a policy of home ownership as a vehicle to creating wealth. And this is a major problem for a large segment of our population. And so we have to think differently about that. And so y'all are smart people. I hope you'll go back and noodle on how we're going to offer people vehicles for wealth creation that don't mean the ownership of a single family home.
All right. Okay. How do you factor people with mobility disabilities into your plans to incentivize biking over driving and parking?
Better transit.
Well, biking is great for many people with physical disabilities, as long as you have excellent infrastructure. In fact, it's better than driving. And if you look at jurisdictions where they have excellent cycling facilities and also have a culture of cycling, it's amazing the way cycling actually becomes a way of giving freedom to people who require mobility devices. The bike becomes a mobility device, like a wheelchair or a walker or some other instrument. So cycling is excellent for many people with disabilities. Not all disabilities, but for the vast majority of disabilities. It's excellent, even in terms of reflexes and the reflexes that you need to drive a car versus being on a bike when you have excellent cycling infrastructure. So to me, this is a complete moot point. And if you do a little bit of a Google search on cycling with disabilities, you'll find there's a wealth of research on this already. I used to have on my desk for many years a picture of my grandmother when she's 98 now. I guess she was maybe 91 or 92 when the photo was taken. So think about that a minute. She's 91 or 92 and she's on her bike and she's biking. And what was so inspiring to me about this photo is that, so my family is originally from Holland, and when my grandmother grew up in Holland, she cycled everywhere. And with a young family after World War II, they moved to Canada, and she, of course, drove everywhere because she lived in an environment where that was the infrastructure. But in her later years, she frequently went back to visit family. And what did she do? She got her bike out, and she biked everywhere. And I think it's such a powerful example of how infrastructure dictates behavior. She would never think of biking where she lived in Canada, because no one biked. There was no cycling culture and there was no infrastructure. But well into her 90s, she didn't hesitate to get on her bike when she went back to Holland. And it gave her a tremendous, and in fact, she got on her bike when her license had been taken away in Canada.
Take that!
She was no longer driving in Canada and she was biking in Amsterdam.
Great. All right, Jacob, thank you, Jacob, for giving us your name. All right, none of you are strangers to community meetings. Changing transportation and housing in cities can depend on them. What works well and what is broken in community meetings? Any tips?
I'll jump in really quick and just say that we use something called social practice artists. Have you ever heard that? Okay. I don't know if the center of this is in Minneapolis, so it's kind of a burgeoning thing. But
what are they?
Social practice artists. So they basically come out and they use things like visual note taking. They use a lot of different kinds of visuals, not just maps, because we as planners, we love our maps. But they also use things like very large format drawings. They do engagement that is more about kind of creative placemaking, more of a kind of problem-solving exercise. And we use that extensively in our 2040 process. I think that was important. I don't know that it's a panacea, but I think it was important because it engages people in a different place in their mind. If you set up a community meeting like this, and I get on the stage and I'm standing 2 feet above you with a microphone, and I am going to try to convince you of something. How many of you are going to be easily convinced in that setting, right? I'm talking at you. We're not having a conversation. And I think there's a real opportunity to do that deeper, sort of more meaningful relationship building in that context, but that takes time and it takes some resources. And that's where I feel like groups that are really kind of pro-development or neighborhood organizations, that's where they can come in and really help this conversation move forward. I also think we need to be talking more with school-age children about the importance of how cities build and grow and change over time. And then the third thing I would just say is that generally the conversation about change, we need to think of that differently in a psychological context, because change is really difficult. And Gil, you mentioned this earlier about people are just really afraid right now. There's just a ton of fear driving the conversation. And that's a difficult space to do this work in.
So I agree with everything that Heather said. Just kind of two things. One is around the tools and shifting from thinking about community meetings to thinking about both community engagement and community capacity building. And community capacity building is a very powerful idea because it's about building citizens. It's about building people who are a part of a co-creation process in how you design the city. We're building 22 kilometers of LRT right through the heart of our city, and over 2 years we created a new plan for the street. We upzoned the entire corridor, and we held over 60 community meetings with various ratepayers associations and BIAs, and we did really tactile things. We used modeling, we used mapping, we got people around the table moving blocks and testing different streetscapes designs by moving all of the pieces together. And that was all about people having an idea and saying, well, let's test that idea. Let's see what the implication of that idea is on space and time. Oh, wait a minute, that idea actually doesn't work in this right-of-way because the right-of-way narrows here to 30 meters and then it widens to 40. So it was a co-creation process. And that plan was quite contentious, and in the end it was approved unanimously by City Council. And in part, I think it was because there were so many people who really rolled up their sleeves. And when it came forward to city council, they came and made deputations, and they felt like it was their plan. They were a part of making the plan because they were a part of making the plan. So I think this notion of capacity building and building constituencies that will also then bring an elevated form of participation to the next engagement is a really valuable part of our city building. And I actually think it's a risk with a strong mayor system, because in a weak mayor system, we have to get the community on side. And in fact, the mayor doesn't actually matter that much. If you have a strong mayor, like someone who is a good collaborator, that's great. But in reality, if you can just get constituents who get their ward councillor to support an idea, you can get it approved. So that capacity building is a really, really important strategy, I think, for building an interest and building support for progressive ideas. The second piece is a really important one, which I just want to flag. We had in another area of the city, so we have a plan for subways, LRTs, an entire new transit network. And in one area of the city where a LRT is proposed, staff came back to me and they said, "Yeah, the community doesn't support the LRT. They don't want it." I was like, "Oh, really? So who was at this meeting?" And so we did an analysis of who was at the meeting versus the demographic analysis of the area. And of course, in this neighborhood in the city where the LRT is proposed, the people who attended the meeting were almost entirely over 65. They were white and they were homeowners. Well, the demographic analysis of the area demonstrated that more than 50% of the residents in that area are non-white, more than 50% are renters, and all the schools are at capacity because there's so many kids. So what's going on in our community meetings? Well, our community meeting was really a way for people who are very empowered to come out and assert their vision at the expense of people who didn't have the capacity to do that. And so as a result of that, I created something called the Planning Review Panel. And through a civic lottery, we created a body that is representative of the residents in the city. Every age, every demographic, racial diversity, every kind of diversity you can imagine. And that panel becomes the checkpoint, if you will. So it's a way around NIMBYism, quite frankly. It's a way around having local communities protecting their local interest at the expense of a citywide interest. So you can Google City of Toronto Planning Review Panel. There's some videos on it, and you can see how it works. But when you see the diversity of the planning review panel, that's what Toronto actually looks like. Our city council is very white. Our city isn't. Our city is very diverse. It's very young. Our council is very white and old.
All right, let me just get to the one last question here from Joshua. What is the driving force of people driving their cars into your city? Is it housing costs, causing people to live further away, or lack of reliable transit?
I think it's both. If I could just throw my answer in on the last question, three principles for me have served me well in my planning career on how to effectively engage people. The first one is go to where people are. Second one is go with an open mind. That goes to the listening piece. And the third one, and people often forget this, is get back to them and tell you what you heard. So they feel heard. And the first one, going to where people are, all the things these two have said, which is make sure you're hitting multiple audiences where they like to gather. You're using community leaders and local conveners, using different languages. I mean, really making sure you're talking to everybody that needs to be talked about. The open mind piece is important, to not have a proposal that you're shopping around for reaction, but you're actually starting with what people value, what their concerns are. You're actually listening, and that goes a long way to, I think, to building trust. And the getting back to people is, whether it's through flyers, whether it's on the internet, whether it's through the media in some way, or whether it's back through those same channels you were using to gather them. All of those are really important, because that does over time build the trust in civic processes, which we have been frayed in North America, I think, since. So I just wanted to toss that out. I think it's both here. I think that standing back, Vancouver's a very young city. It became a city, if you will, probably later than when the Paris subway was constructed. So if you think about 125, 130-year-old transit system, it's a whole network and web in Paris, which was the inspiration for the Boston system, which is the oldest in North America. That established so much of how Paris has grown and established itself. We don't have that in North American cities for the most part. So we're aggressively trying to build it out in Vancouver, but we're not reaching everybody, and particularly at the further reaches of the region. It is also true that people are chasing lower housing costs further and further out. So it's sort of a double whammy that we have to reverse. And so doubling down both on affordable housing in the core and on regional transit investments, you shouldn't do one without the other. They're both needed.
Yeah, I think cheap gas is a problem in America. I think it's still a much less expensive proposition for you to drive a car, or at least you think it is. And then the combination of that with really poor transit service for most of our large communities is just it continues to be one of our biggest challenges to overcome on a legislative standpoint in Minnesota. We do not have any durable, consistent funding for transit in the state. We continually go to the state legislature every year and go begging to run our light rail system and our bus system. And that is not sustainable for that community from an economic development standpoint. So that's something that I think probably is not unique to Minneapolis, sadly.
Okay, we're out of time. We could go for another hour, but thank you very much to all of our panelists. We didn't get to all the questions, but I think that these guys could all stick around until 9 before we get kicked out.
Can you show the picture of the world's tallest passive house?
Oh, yeah, see, we didn't get to that. Can you, Adam, can you put up our last picture? And then, right, this.
Another place where we're taking a bit of adventure in San Francisco is on the net zero buildings. And so, what'd I say? San
Francisco.
Vancouver.
Don't work there anymore.
Thank you. Jeez, thank you very much. So the building of the two tall buildings in the center, the building on the right was approved and is now under construction as some energy reduction qualities to it. It's pretty good and is kind of the standard new build. The one on the left with the more sinuous outline there, the past mayor couldn't decide between two guys who both wanted tall buildings at this high point on the downtown landscape, so he gave them the exact same height, which makes a bit of an awkward form. But the virtue of the one on the left, aside from it being an unusual design, is that it will be the tallest passive house in the world. And we're pushing that hard because building of that scale, and there's actually another one that's been already approved a little bit off the screen here, not quite as tall, but it's a twin tower, has the ability to transform the supply chain for things like windows, ventilation systems, all the stuff that smaller buildings are going to need but can't get there. We're importing windows from Germany. We're getting materials from all over the globe. This could change, add to the economic development capacity of the Vancouver region and make this a much more feasible thing. So, and we do things in our zoning and development bylaw to promote these. We relax our FAR standards to accommodate thicker walls, in this case, a pretty generous central ventilation system.
How many units?
We give credit against developer fees for the premium cost and so forth. So we're thinking this is probably a 6 to 8% premium on cost, although because it's such an unusual building, they'll probably make that back. We're finding in the 6-story passive house buildings, which are now becoming typical on the corridors, or at least more routine on the corridors, it's about a 3 to 4% cost differential, but the occupants see immediate savings in their monthly energy bills. So
how many units?
In this one? This one is 550 feet tall and about 55 stories, and I think it's several hundred units, probably on the order of.
So your use of the word house does not indicate one unit.
Passive house is, I should say, a standard which was developed first in Germany to really focus on the envelope of building to be very tightly sealed.
Thank
and
you.
They actually have great health benefits besides, because the air quality is much better, the sound insulation is better. And so we took a whole group of developers to Brussels, which is kind of the epicenter now for this stuff, in April of this year, and they drank the Kool-Aid. They want to do this stuff. As long as there are incentives to do it, they're on board. And I think we will transform the industry because of that in Vancouver.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for, everybody's welcome to come up and ask more questions. Please look at, I
couldn't let
have to
Jennifer
give a
have
plug.
all
I
the
gotta
eye
remember.
candy tonight.
Please go to the City Space website and fill out a survey if you haven't already. And thank you all very much for coming tonight. Hope to see you back here. Thank you.
It did reveal a bit of bias in my thinking, and I'm okay with being called out on it. And I guess that's the conversation I'm urging. I'm trying to have it, and I'm urging my colleagues to have it, which is listen when you're called out. Think about these books in which people write about people of color as if they're food.